The winter of 2009 hit Cleveland, Ohio like a punishment. Not just cold and cruel, the kind of cold that crawls through walls, seeps under doors, and reminds people exactly where they stand in this world. And in the Stockton Avenue neighborhood, most people already knew where they stood. At the bottom, paycheck to paycheck, prayer to prayer, one broken water pipe away from disaster. Marcus Webb was 41 years old, a former auto worker who had lost his job 8 months earlier when the plant closed. He had a wife named Diane, a 12-year-old daughter named Aaliyah, and exactly $47 in his bank account. He wore the same coat every day, a navy blue parka with a broken zipper he held together with a safety pin. His boots had a crack along the left sole that let in water when it rained. He had stopped telling Diane about the boots because she would worry, and Diane was already carrying too much worry for one woman. Every morning, Marcus walked 6 blocks to the corner of Stockton and 14th, where a small group of men gathered looking for day labor. Sometimes there was work. Most days there wasn't. He would stand there in the cold for 2, sometimes 3 hours, hands shoved in his pockets, breath coming out in white clouds, watching cars pass. On the days there was no work, he would walk back home slowly, taking the long way so Diane wouldn't see him return too soon and understand what that meant. On the morning of December 3rd, there was no work. Marcus was walking back through the neighborhood when he saw her, an old woman, sitting on the front steps of a brown brick house on Maplewood Street. She was maybe 75, small and fragile looking, wearing a thin housecoat with a shawl pulled around her shoulders. She was just sitting there in the freezing cold, looking at the street like she was waiting for something that was never going to come. Marcus almost kept walking. He had his own problems. He had $47 and a daughter who needed winter boots, and a wife who hadn't slept properly in weeks. He had no business stopping, but he stopped. "Ma'am," he said, "you okay?" She looked up at him. Her eyes were brown and clear, sharper than her frail body suggested. "My furnace went out last night," she said. "I called my son, but he's in Atlanta. I don't know who else to call." Her name was Ruth Elaine Patterson. She had lived in that house for 43 years. Her husband Harold had died in 2004. She had 3 children, one in Atlanta, one in Phoenix, one who no longer called. She had $200 in her checking account and a furnace that the repairman, when he finally came 2 days later, would say needed a full replacement costing $400. But Marcus didn't know any of that yet. What he knew in that moment was that this woman was cold and alone, and that it was 23 degrees outside. "Come on," he said, "let me help you inside." He sat with her in her cold house for 4 hours that day. He found an old space heater in her basement and got it running. He made her tea on her gas stove. He called 3 furnace companies on her behalf and got quotes she couldn't afford. Before he left, he gave her his cell number and told her to call if she needed anything. He walked home that afternoon and said nothing to Diane about any of it. But he thought about Ruth all night. The next morning he went back. He brought a bag of groceries, bread, soup, eggs, things they could barely spare from their own kitchen. Diane had packed the bag without asking questions, which told Marcus that she already understood more than he had said. That was the thing about Diane Webb, she always understood. Over the following week, Marcus became a kind of unofficial caretaker for Ruth Patterson. He checked on her every day. He brought wood from a neighbor's yard and kept a fire going in her old fireplace. He shoveled her steps. He sat with her in the evenings sometimes while she told him about Harold, about her children, about Cleveland in the 1960s, when Maplewood Street had been full of life and music on summer nights. And Ruth, in her quiet way, started to understand what Marcus's life actually looked like. She saw the cracked boot when he walked in one evening and snow had melted through to his sock. She saw how carefully he counted out exact change when he stopped at the corner store. She heard the tiredness in his voice that had nothing to do with sleep. Ruth Patterson had lived long enough to recognize a man who was holding everything together with both hands and running out of grip. One evening she said to him, "Marcus, what do you need?" He laughed it off. "I'm fine, Ruth." "No," she said, in a voice that didn't argue, it just stated facts. "You're not. What do you need?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Aaliyah needs boots. Her school ones are done. I keep telling her next week. It's been 4 next weeks." Ruth nodded slowly and said nothing more that night. 2 days later, Ruth called her son in Atlanta. His name was Derek, and he was doing well. Mortgage broker, nice house, 2 cars. Their relationship was complicated in the way that relationships between parents and children who have moved far away often become complicated. Calls on birthdays, visits at Thanksgiving. A vague guilt that never quite resolved itself into action. Ruth didn't ask Derek for money for herself. She had too much pride for that, and Derek knew it, which was partly why he had let the distance grow. She told him about Marcus. She told him everything, the daily visits, the groceries, the firewood, the cracked boot, the little girl waiting for winter boots. She told Derek that this man, this unemployed man with $47 in his account, had spent 2 weeks making sure she didn't freeze to death, and had never once asked for anything in return. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Derek said, "Mom, I'm coming home." He arrived on December 18th with a check for the furnace repair. Not a replacement. A repair that a different company said would actually hold. And $200 he pressed into Marcus's hand in Ruth's living room, while Marcus tried to refuse it, and Derek wouldn't hear a word of it. He also had in a shopping bag a pair of girls' winter boots in size 6, purple with white fur lining, because Ruth had found out Aaliyah's size by asking Marcus a question that seemed like it had nothing to do with boots. Marcus Webb stood in that living room holding $200 cash and a pair of purple boots, and he could not speak for almost a full minute. When he finally did, he said, "I wasn't doing it for this." "I know," Derek said. "That's exactly why you deserve it." But the story doesn't end in that living room, because nothing real ever ends that cleanly. What happened next is what actually matters. Marcus came home that evening and put the boots on the kitchen table. Aaliyah screamed when she saw them, that pure, unfiltered joy that only 12-year-olds are still capable of, and Diane pressed her hand over her mouth and looked at Marcus with eyes that asked 100 questions at once. He told her everything. Ruth, the furnace, the weeks of visits, Derek's arrival. He talked for a long time. Diane didn't say a word until he finished. Then she said, "You fed someone else's mother when we were running low?" He nodded. She was quiet. Then she said, "Good, that's who I married." That Christmas on Stockton Avenue was hard. Marcus found 4 days of work in the last 2 weeks of December. They bought Aaliyah 2 small gifts and made a decent meal and called it enough because it was enough. But something had shifted in Marcus that December. Something he wouldn't have the words for until much later. He had spent 8 months feeling like the plant closing had taken something from him that he couldn't name. Not just the job, not just the income. Something about who he was. Something about what he was for. And then he had walked past an old woman on cold steps and stopped. And in stopping, he had found it again. The thing that couldn't be laid off. The thing that didn't require a paycheck or a title or a working furnace to exist. By February, he had a new job. Not at a plant, at a warehouse. Less money, harder hours, but steady. He kept visiting Ruth twice a week. Derek started calling his mother every Sunday. By spring, Derek was visiting once a month. By summer, something in that fractured family had quietly, imperfectly begun to heal. Ruth never said Marcus's name without something changing in her face, like she was referring to a fact about the world that she found privately astonishing. And Aaliyah, every morning that winter and through the following spring, she wore those purple boots to school. She wore them until they were worn through, and even then, she kept them in the back of her closet. And when her mother asked why, she said, "Because they mean something. I don't know exactly what, but they mean something." She was right. She just didn't have the full story yet. Years later, this is 2019, a decade after that winter, Aaliyah Webb is 22 years old and in her final year of a social work degree at Cleveland State University. She is writing a thesis on community care networks in low-income urban neighborhoods. She is interviewing people across Cleveland about informal acts of mutual aid, neighbors helping neighbors, strangers becoming anchors, the invisible systems of survival that never appear in any government report. One afternoon, her professor mentions a woman on Maplewood Street, an elderly woman, remarkable woman, known in the neighborhood for being a kind of unofficial hub of community connection. The professor says the woman has been talking to anyone who will listen about how one act of kindness in the winter of 2009 changed the entire social fabric of her block. Aaliyah goes to interview her. She rings the doorbell of a brown brick house. The door opens. A small woman, 85 years old now, Sharp brown eyes, a shawl around her shoulders. They look at each other. Ruth Patterson's face does something extraordinary. Her eyes fill up immediately. The way eyes do when recognition and memory and time all arrive at once. "I know you," Ruth says softly. "I know exactly who you are." Aaliyah doesn't understand yet. "I'm Aaliyah Webb. I'm a student at—" "I know who you are," Ruth says again, and her voice is barely above a whisper. "Come inside. I have something to tell you." They sit in that same living room where Derek once pressed $200 into Marcus Webb's hands, and Ruth tells her everything. The whole story. From the morning she sat on the cold steps to the purple boots to what Derek said and what it unlocked. She tells it slowly and completely. The way old people tell stories. They have been waiting a long time to tell to exactly the right person. Aaliyah Webb sits across from this woman and listens, and does not write a single word in her research notebook. When Ruth finishes, the room is very quiet. Then Aaliyah reaches into her bag and puts her notebook on the table. She opens it to the first page. At the top, she has written the title of her thesis, the question she has been trying to answer for 3 years of academic work. It reads, "What makes a community survive when every system fails it?" She looks at Ruth Patterson. "I think," Aaliyah says slowly, her voice unsteady, "I've been trying to find a complicated answer to a very simple question." Ruth reaches across the table and puts her small, weathered hand over Aaliyah's young one. "Your father knew the answer," Ruth says. "He knew it on a cold morning in December when he had 47 in a broken boot, and he stopped anyway. He stopped. That's all it was. That's all it ever is." Aaliyah Webb does not write her thesis that night. She calls her father. Marcus answers on the second ring. She tells him where she has been. She tells him what Ruth said. She tells him about the thesis question and the answer she found in a brown brick house on Maplewood Street. Marcus Webb, 51 years old, sitting in the kitchen of the same house on Stockton Avenue, is quiet for a long time. Then he says, "Baby, I wasn't doing anything special that winter. I was just doing what felt like the only human thing to do." "I know, Dad," Aaliyah says. "That's exactly what makes it special." Outside, Cleveland is cold again. It is always cold again. The world does not stop being hard. The furnaces do not stop breaking. The jobs do not stop disappearing. The boots do not stop wearing through. Empty pockets are not a season. They are a permanent condition for more people than anyone in power wants to count. But on Stockton Avenue, in a kitchen that has seen better financial years and worse emotional ones, a man who once had $47 and a cracked boot and a neighbor he didn't have to help sits, with the phone pressed to his ear, listening to his daughter's voice, and understands, fully finally, without needing any more words, that the only thing he ever had that truly mattered, he never lost, not for a single day, not once.